Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, hello and welcome. For those that have used GoToWebinar before, please let me know in the question box whether you can see the famous Pink Floyd icon and whether you can hear me. This is our cheating way. Yep, thanks. Thank you. Everyone's on the board with this now. Awesome. Thanks, guys. I'd like to acknowledge the First Nation people throughout the land where I'm speaking from, the traditional lands of the people of the Kulin Nation, the Wurundjeri people in Melbourne, and I'd like to acknowledge them as traditional owners and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and the elders in other communities, and acknowledge that the land on where I'm meeting and we're all meeting today is a place of age-old ceremonies and celebration, initiation, and land that was never ceded. Welcome to today's webinar. We're going to be talking about setting community emissions reduction targets, specifically science derived targets, and have some pretty awesome guests. Here is the running sheet. We've got a fair bit to go through, so we're going to pretty much just jump straight into it. I'm going to do a really quick bit of housekeeping first. So GoToWebinar, as I think most of the people on the line know, it's a little bit different to Zoom and all the other things we're used to this year. We can't hear any of the guests, so it's only the presenters that can be heard throughout the presentation. And I'll ask those guys who are presenting to please make sure you're muting yourself. Jump in anytime with questions in the GoToWebinar question box. Just make sure it's really specific what your question's about, who it's for. And if we don't get to it all today, we'll definitely be able to get to it later. This is quite an interesting topic around targets, and I think we're going to have some very differing views discussing this today, and just want to point out that that's totally okay. I know within the Ironbark office, we've often had very robust discussions about the point of targets, what they are, how they mean, how they work, and what they should be used for. And I think that's okay, and it's really good to have that conversation with everyone, because people are coming at it from different perspectives, as we'll go through in a second. And finally, we are recording. I hope we're recording. Yep, we are recording. Today, we try and, as most people know, keep these pretty informal. It's the end of 2020. This is going to be really informal, and apologies in advance if we get a little bit sloppy at times, because, you know, it's 2020. Post-webinar, you can download a 20-page doco. All we need is a little bit of information or feedback from you. We just want to know what you thought and how we can improve these things, and what you want us to put on in future webinars. But we've got a 20-page doco that essentially goes through and explains a bit of background on targets and things that you can do, and a little bit of advice, some of the issues with setting targets in certain ways. This is Ironbark. We work with councils around Australia on climate programs. That's pretty much it. I'm going to cut through our background. Most of you will know we work on programmatic approaches to reducing emissions, and we have done for about 15, 20 odd years. All we do is work with councils around Australia on climate, corporate and community programs. This is you. There are 113 registrations at the end. Don't know how, 68 odd on board at the moment. From all around Australia, which is great. Here's the state-by-state breakup, just so you know. These slides will be available afterwards, and so again, if this sort of stuff is interesting to you, you can have access to it afterwards. And we've got a great mix of people who have been at councils for various amounts of times, and we do use this info to try and target, I guess, you know, how much time we put into various bits of background information or otherwise. But it's a really good mix, I guess, here today. And here are your questions and / comments. Some of them are questions, and we're going to get to these. So thank you for bringing these up. Some of them are comments, and thank you for those too. Forgive me if I've already registered and I don't want to take a place if numbers are limited. Such a lovely bunch of people. We also asked you in advance, why do you think it's important to have a community emissions reduction target? This is the best I could do with a word cloud because it was quite challenging getting the sentences. Those that would have received an Ironbark newsletter a few days ago, we actually collated and sent through all of the responses, and it's really quite interesting. And again, we'll touch on this today, why you actually have a target, because people or councils set targets for different reasons. Some are looking at it to actually look at accountability, to try and measure impact. Others, it's an act of getting the community on board and making sure that everyone's singing from the same song sheet. There are different reasons to have targets. Okay, I'm going to get straight into passing on to Imogen Jubb from Beyond Zero Emissions. Before I do, Imogen, today's about targets, as you know, and we all well know. And in the past, when we look at a sort of programmatic approach to reducing emissions, this is nothing new or revolutionary. We look at insight or baseline or inventory sort of side of things. Then we step on to targets, strategy, action, and evaluation. We think and we hope that we've already fixed up the insights thing for, well, hopefully every council within Australia. And we do actually have a special thing, if I can get my computer to work. Where are we here? To talk about the insights side of things. So bear with me. I'm going to put this up and hope you can hear this.
I think we're all aware that when we're trying to hit a target in our private lives, whether that's trying to achieve a certain amount of kilometres on the treadmill at the gym, that we need a starting point. We need a solid baseline measurement. And despite all the great work that councils and communities have done to lower their emissions in the past decade, this has largely been done without access to local data, without really...
Turn it up, everyone's saying, can't hear it. Yeah, I don't know what I'm going to be able to do about that. I'll give it one more go. And if not, we'll send it out afterwards.
About where the emissions are coming from in that particular municipality. Well, now, Beyond Zero Emissions, Ironbark Sustainability and local governments have developed a free tool called Snapshot Climate, and allows you to put in your postcode, and then up will come the areas where you're generating the emissions in your community across transport, electricity, waste, agriculture, land use changes. And what it does is allow you to now have some really solid ammunition to write to your council, to express the areas of concern that need changing in your area. And the tool is also linked to Beyond Zero Emissions Million Jobs Plan. So you can also say to the council, hey, there's this terrific opportunity to create more jobs while we're dealing with these problems and lowering our emissions. Get involved. It's snapshotclimate.com.au, a terrific initiative. Get on there and start writing to your council and raising that awareness about where the emissions are coming from in your particular region.
All right, Imogen, I'm going to pass to you and give you control. You can talk to that if you like, and you can explain why councils are going to get all these letters. I'm going to give you control in just a second. Now, Imogen has a baby in the background, so we're just going to, again...
No, she's out of the house now, it's all right.
Well done.
I'm not quite sure how to share screen yet. I think you have to send that through to me. As a
I haven't given it to you yet. It's coming.
But yeah, we're pretty sure Snapshot's a tool I think most of you are aware of, but it's pretty nice to get some promo from movie makers and the like, sharing it with the community. And here we go, I can share my screen now. So I'll just make this, hang on. Can you guys see that?
Yep.
I don't want to leave the webinar, I just want to be able to go to present. Hang on, I'll just do it. So I don't know how to make it full screen because the present button's underneath the, hang on, aha, here we go. Not share, whoops, sorry.
That's all right, we'll get there.
There we go. So yeah, I'm from Beyond Zero Emissions and I help manage the Zero Carbon Communities program, which now has about 120 odd communities around Australia. who are looking to reduce emissions in their local area and also looking to find the multiple benefits for their communities, including jobs and thanks. So for those of you who don't know, Beyond Zero Emissions is a think tank. We've been around for a bit over 10 years, and our purpose is to show how Australia can thrive through a transition to a zero carbon economy. We've been doing some pretty groundbreaking work in each of the different sectors, showing the research that shows it's possible to get to zero emissions in each sector, and that it's achievable and affordable to do so for each sector as well. And now really the community's work is about showing how to actually implement these solutions with real people in real places with real problems and real decision making. So it's a pretty exciting point in time. So yeah, we do a lot of research, and we do a lot of communities work, and we also work with a lot of businesses and government as well to help show how to decarbonise each sector. And I've been working particularly with a lot of investors to show how to put investments into communities where they identify projects of interest that can decarbonise. How do you actually match the investment to make them all possible? So the biggest report we put out this year was the Million Jobs Plan, and it shows how we can rebuild Australia's economy. In total, we identified 1.8 million jobs across the country in the next 5 years. And most of those jobs are in regions and communities where they're needed the most. So it's a massive opportunity for councils to step up to help enable these jobs and these projects. There's 200,000 jobs in renewable energy and transmission, almost 1 million jobs in retrofits and new buildings. And that's actually an area where council has some influence as well. There's jobs in electric buses and new green transport, almost 250,000 jobs in clean manufacturing and mining, and lots of jobs in land regeneration as well, and waste. So there are many, many opportunities that will not only bring economic benefits to communities and lots of, secure jobs, but also bring multiple social and environmental benefits at the same time. And they also, a lot of this work reduces the cost of living for the most vulnerable in the community, and also makes their housing safer, and deals with the kind of adaptation issues around climate change as we're facing more and more heat waves and bushfire risks and the like. So Zero Carbon Communities is an ever-growing network of communities across Australia who are working together to achieve zero carbon status. And it's really clear that building community support and involvement is instrumental in turning this vision into action. And with our targets, BZE's always sort of had the frame of a 10-year time frame for transition. So when we put out the stationary energy report in 2010, it was demonstrating that this change was possible in a 10-year time frame. And we've had that framing for all of our reports. And there's a couple of reasons for that, but it kind of boils down to it being necessary. It's also achievable, and it's also affordable, so we can do it. When I started working with Beyond Zero Emissions, we wanted to do a bit of a review to see where local governments and local local communities were at with their climate targets and climate actions. So we produced the Australian Local Government Climate Review in 2018, and Italy and I Embark were collaborators on that project. It's quite a good summary of the situation for councils, and we're currently doing a kind of update to that piece of work as well. And I've got a little bit of preliminary data to share with you around that as well. So we have done, in the last couple of months, we've done a web-based desktop review of every local government website in the country. And we just asked a few simple questions, and we had a team of volunteers. For those of you who don't know, much of BZE's work is enabled by volunteers. So we got them to look at every council website and see if they could find information on climate change, to see if there was a publicly available target for council and a publicly available target for community-wide emissions. So this is the breakdown of those results. So 50% of councils in Australia provide no information on climate change whatsoever, but there are, clearly the other 50% are doing quite a lot of work. These are the questions that were asked. Sorry, it's a bit annoying with these things popping up. So is there any information on climate change on the website? Is there a current target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions for council operations? Is there a target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions for the community? Are there strategies, actions or plans available for council or for the community? And are there actions on reducing or saving energy? So this is the data from 2018 and this is the data from 2020. And I'm sorry, this button's in the way. As you can see, ultimately there's not a lot of difference between those 2 years. So there hasn't been a really big step change in this period, which is interesting, partly given the increase in councils declaring a climate emergency. There doesn't seem to be an increase in target setting along with that. So this is the kind of summary of those results. So at the moment, only 9% of Australian councils have a target for both council and community, and yet quite a lot have strategies available for both council and community. Only 21% of Australian councils have a target to reduce council emissions, and only 10% have a strategy to reduce target and strategy to reduce community wide emissions. So there's still quite a lot of work to do to step up these numbers and to step up the actions that follow from setting a target in the first place. This is a bit of a messy graph, but it just shows the state breakdown. So at the top, ACT is kicking all the goals except for council operations because they're not a council. And then Victoria is ahead of the pack in other states. So there is a bit of a breakdown according to the states. I expect this is primarily due to the existence of the Victorian greenhouse alliances and some positive state policies in Victoria. I think the other communities can, match Victoria pretty easily and pretty quickly if they choose to. In terms of actually setting targets, our recommendations are to make sure that they're community-wide. There's a lot of reasons for this, primarily that council operations are usually only about 1% of the community-wide emissions. So if you're only tackling 1% of the problem, it's not going to make the difference that we need to make. And that you need to bring the community and partner with the community to actually enable those emissions to get reduced. And that the community is actually an amazing resource for councils if they choose to work together. And also making sure that any targets include more than one sector, so not just energy and buildings, but also looking at transport, waste, industry and land use if you're a regional community. We really strongly advise the 10-year timeframe. There's also many reasons for that. One of them is, it's necessary to keep us within a safe climate, but also there's very little accountability if you're thinking beyond 10 years. And also people can't really imagine beyond their 10-year timeframe. So if you're talking about 2050 targets, it's really out of people's comprehension in terms of they can't see themselves in 2050. So they can't imagine what that world will look like, and therefore they can't see their role they play in it. So it's also important to set short-term interim targets to track that progress and accountability. And there's also a lot of work to be done to actually do effective monitoring and evaluation so that we can actually see which actions are leading to success and make sure we replicate those. I think that's it from me.
Awesome. Thank you, Imogen. I'm going to take back control. And while I do that, though, I'm just going to say one thing I should have said at the start, which is we've got a few guests. Imogen Jubb, who just spoke. Sally Moxham, you can possibly see on the screen as well, who's going to be talking. Sally from Global Covenant of Mayors, and David Spratt from Breakthrough Institute coming in soon. Okay, let's see, show my screen, and let's get into it. And if the rest of you guys online could please mute yourself, that would be awesome. I'm going to assume that everything can be seen now and get into it. All right. Targets are a pretty clear part of most programmatic approaches, and so that is generally why councils do set targets. We've had councils in the past set them through programs like Cities for Climate Protection, and this slide that I've shown, I know a lot of times, just mentioning that it is quite interesting considering Imogen just said we've got 5 or 10% of councils with community emissions and corporate targets. This wasn't always the case, and there actually used to be a time when we had a lot. And I don't know whether, that is as important now, considering we are moving into a time when targets are a lot more sophisticated. And this is community emission reduction targets as well. 240 odd councils, 84% of the population. I think it is still quite important though, because we can learn a lot from what happened back then. And a lot of us, myself included, who were involved in setting these targets, can look at the things that work and don't work. For example, Yarra, an extraordinarily leading council for quite a long time, and I don't mean to pick on them, but they're good the way they share this information. This is for a corporate target. They set a 30% reduction level by 2015 on 28 levels. They missed it by 0.5%, and they get slammed by some idiot in the Herald Sun. And so framing the targets is important. It's one of the things that we've learned from there. And also, especially when talking about community-wide targets, is that we have these goals, targets, and this is the way we're going to go about them, but making sure that there are really clear lines of accountability that are made clear within publications that say this is what we can do, this is what we have impact, this is what we can control, and this is what we can advocate for. And certainly a lot of the recent climate emergency action plans that are out there at the moment make that really clear. It's definitely worth having a look at the likes of Mornington's, Yarra's, and Moreland's, some good recent examples that explain in detail about how the difference is between impact, advocacy, and the level of control. So the question we asked at the start of this was quite interesting. Why do you think it's important to have a community emissions target? And my favourite answer was actually, I'm not sure it is, because I think that's totally legit, and it's not going to be the same for every council. But for some councils, I totally agree with that point, and the person that brought it up, that it is not important, or it is not the most important thing. There was another query that came up from someone in advance saying, my councillors, or 5 out of 9 anyway, don't believe in climate change, don't believe local government has a role, so what do I do and help? So setting a target is possibly not the most important thing for a council in that situation. And the answer to your question there for the person that wrote that in is I'd be Googling Sarah Barker from Mint Ellison ASAP, and she'll talk about risks, fiduciary duties, and scare the shit out of councils really quickly to take that other approach. Setting science-derived targets for a council like that is not the way you're going to get action. From my experience, councils' capacity to set targets or even deliver action, the dynamic product of so many different factors: community and council support, internal, external policy settings, council resourcing, capacity, technology. So it's not that simple. So why, at the end of the day, I certainly think for most councils, for the main, it is important. It is not always the case. People, councils, organisations set targets for different reasons. So for some, it's to measure success. What have we achieved? What do we need to achieve? For others, it is to drive action, and at the level commensurate with the problem that is faced. And so with community 2030, 2040 net zero targets, the kind of action that's required is a lot more than potentially the piecemeal stuff that's been happening in the past. Common goal, accountability to make sure that there's something that can be addressed and you have an external accountability for it. Targets can be used to inspire. And again, a lot of councils and a lot of the, what have we got, 78 on the line now, don't need targets to inspire people and communities, and that's okay. But for some, this can be quite an important thing, and also for leadership. So different things for different councils. And this is the same with the targets that we see everywhere, except for these guys. So we often talk about targets being SMART. I'm going to hope most people know that acronym, and don't forget, you can download this PowerPoint at the end, so no need to take detailed notes. Some targets that aren't SMART are still there for different reasons. So this is the target to get the road toll down to zero in Victoria, the Towards Zero campaign. It's designed to inspire, to educate, promote road safety. There's their website, there's our target, zero. It is not SMART, it is not achievable. We can't stop until we reach zero deaths and serious injuries. I think most people would say that getting to a zero road toll, while it's a aspirational target, is not possible. And so instead, this is used for communication purposes instead. They've done their research and said that the zero target is the way to get people involved and head towards that, the aim, which is to reduce road toll and road trauma. These targets here, for those that are south of the New South Wales border, we know these quite well. These were targets that we used to inspire and educate. For example, this one here, and any Victorian will have this rattling in their ears for the next couple of decades, targeting a rolling average of under 5 over 14 days. So this target's used to communicate a pretty complicated thing in a very simple way. Football clubs have targets for memberships to inspire, celebrate and lead, get on board and be part of it. That's what the North Melbourne Football Club did in 2012. Others use targets because it will fit in with political realities, but also then try down the track to look at what it means from a science point of view. I think this is an interesting one because the ALP's net zero announcement was welcomed by the Climate Council this year. Now, the Climate Council clearly talks about net zero by 2030 targets, but this is when we appreciate the fact that targets aren't locked in forever. And so the idea here is that we want to make sure that, for example, this particular government gets in, or the announcement from the Climate Council, I assume, is trying to find a federal government, should I say, that is going to set an ambitious target. But the first step is to make sure that they've got a target that fits in with what is often known as the Overton window. So something that is going to be within the bounds of acceptable policy. And then the next step is to try and look at making that target more in line with what's expected and what's required. And 2050 by zero is absolutely not enough. Councils, we've got targets in everything. This is from any council plan within Australia. You've got targets for things like percentage of people feeling safe walking at night, or community members who are satisfied with their health. Councils don't have complete control over that, but they can still look at how they can impact it, and they publicly talk about their targets. In Australian local governments, most targets have probably up until here been aspirational. I'll go through this quite quickly as well, because again, most people have seen these as well, but it's a little bit of a refresher. The aspirational political target, so a bit of a social or political construct. And if I can just ask the presenters to please put themselves on mute for a second. For example, by 2025, levels of mercury in our water supply is going to be zero. This is really good at unifying action. It's potentially not going to be great at assessing the efficacy of a program and whether or not it's actually going to give you the desired result. For example, people not being sick. The bottom-up target, looking at exactly what we're going to do. So our strategies to reduce mercury, we're going to do A, B, C, D, E, and we're going to see that the levels of mercury are going to stay below a certain amount. This can provide guidance and motivation. Potentially, it's not great at ensuring that the target is actually going to be met, what's required. It's just going to say, here's where we're going to get to. This is something that you see commonly in councils' corporate action plans. We've got a base year and we've got a target year, and we are going to put in X million dollars for X resourcing, and we will see emissions reduced by 63.4%. We have control over it, and this is what we're going to be able to do. And finally, the science-derived or top-down target set by an external limit. Provides a hard limit of what's required. It gives you minimum performance. Whether or not it's actually going to be good at motivating action is probably a question that's still yet to be answered. Here's an example. The number of secondary infections generated by infected people. So this is herd immunity for measles. We need coverage to be at a certain amount, 94%. That's what the science says. Australia's national coverage target is 95% in any given community. This is in line with the science. So the science-derived target for measles and herd immunity and vaccination, 94%. And the target and the science doesn't care what people say, what people do. It's quite simply, we need 94% to hit that herd immunity. For those that aren't up with pop culture or television, that dickhead on the left is Pete Evans, science denier, Trump supporter, and all-round knob. Okay, so here's how we do it for local governments and climate. Science-derived targets, or targets that are derived from what the science says. Now this, and it's an important point that I'm hoping David will touch on as well after this, because there are concerns that are brought up, or contested ideas, I guess, around the conservative nature of IPCC's science. But what the IPCC says is that we have a carbon budget of 1,701 gigatons between 2000 and 2050. So that's our budget, if you like, if you want to use the IPCC's data. And this is to have a 66% chance of staying under 2 degrees warming. Australia have gone through and got our own fair share budget based on this amount. and it's 10.1 gigatons. And so this is from Climate Works and the Climate Change Authority. And again, this process that I'm going through now is purely based on the data that comes from the IPCC, the Australian Climate Change Authority, and if this changes, we and the numbers obviously change with the science as well. But what you can do is you can get that global budget, the Australian budget, and then take it down to the local level. Councils have done this in the past simply by scaling it down to the local municipal level by population. We're not sure whether that's fair and equitable, even just within the Australian context, because some councils have a better opportunity or a better way to actually reduce emissions because they might be growing at a higher or lower rate because of socioeconomic indicators and because of the makeup of their emissions. And so what we do is we can incorporate these factors within to a target and scale it accordingly. So going back to how it works, we've got our global budget, our Australian budget, and then our local budget, bearing in mind the Australian budget based on the IPCC and Climate Change Authority figures is down to about 6.4 gigatons, and that's only for 2 degrees and only a 66% chance. But what we can do is scale it to the local level as well. Here's an example, the City of Stonington. Using the unscaled budget, so that's the thing up the top, if you just go by population, there's a certain amount and they've got 15 years. If they don't do anything at all, in 15 years, it's gone. Taking into account the fact that the City of Stonington is an area where there is more potential to reduce emissions compared to other municipalities around Australia, given its growth trajectories and where it sits as a council with a lot of resources, we scale it. And so they have 10 years instead of 15. Likewise, Inner West in Sydney, quite a well-resourced council compared to others. And so the similar sort of budget, if you look when it's just unscaled, so it's just according to population, 14 years. They do nothing, but in 14 years, their budget is gone. However, taking into account where they sit as a local government in Australia that has more resources than others, once we scale it, it goes down to 9 years. Here's an example of, I guess, the opposite, a council, Boganshire. I've always wanted to talk about Boganshire. They've got 15 years, again, if you just scale it to a population, but a council like that, council area that has large ag or other emissions and declining rate base and or issues around or lower socioeconomic, you can get outlier councils like that, so the budget is shared and they have more time to reduce. These sort of discussions and calculations have been discussed through by a range of stakeholders over the last couple of years to make sure that everyone's sort of on the same page and we're all using the same budget. Okay, where's my mouse? Sorry. Oh, God. Come back, mouse. There we go. A very good question, I guess, is whether this is ambitious enough and whether the targets that are out there at the moment are ambitious enough. So Australia doesn't really have a federal target, but by proxy, we kind of do with all the states having net zero by 2050 targets at the moment. I'm not sure you consider that to be in line with the science. I'm sure if you ask those states, they would say it absolutely is. BZE, Imogen's already explained their take on it, the 10-year time frame, which we broadly agree with. We're going to hear from the Global Covenant of Mayors, a program that requires councils to set a target. The Climate Council often talks about the 10-year time frame as well, but I couldn't find a set target there, if you like. Same with the Cities Power Partnership, which are looking at whether targets become a part of their process and their program. Take two, Victorian government doesn't have one, and the Climate Emergency Australia, we don't have a logo yet, so there's the guy that's running Climate Emergency Australia at the moment, Dave Mickeljohn. They're dealing with targets to say follow the science. If IPCC report in April says we need stronger targets, then we do that. Sorry for David, that's a bit of an unfair photo. There's a better one for you. The councils that are out there at the moment, and so this is the recent targets just in the last year or two, and basically every single council community target that we've seen in the last sort of 18 to 24 months has involved net zero. They've generally got a 2030, 2040, 2050. I apologise in advance if any of these have been updated lately, and I'm happy to correct the record afterwards. These are changing a little bit, but this is what was publicly available. So a mixture there. But what the Science Derived Targets approach generally will do is say you've got 9 to 16 years, and that's for the 2 degrees carbon budget. And when you start looking at 1.5 degrees, it's arguable that there's nothing, it's run out, and this cannot be done without drawdown, and I know David will get into this a little bit. There are other methodologies and other state governments and political parties that will say that there is still a 1.5 degree budget, but it's quite challenging. So 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees, it's not just a matter of having a different budget and changing that 1,701 gigatons to a smaller amount. There are quite a few issues with this. There's no consensus, there's no common ground truth. You will find that different organisations and different parties will have different takes on the data and the science, and in the document that you can receive after this webinar, we've got some sources there that explain here are what different people say about it, and we've got one that's going to come on soon to talk about that as well. There is less data. There's potentially no credible pathway for 1.5 degrees. Now that's a bit of an issue. If we've already set in stone for 1.5 degrees and councils want to use their targets to actually talk about how they're going to get there, then you need to start talking about drawdown, or you need to really reassess the way you're communicating it. There's no official budget, and so there is an official IPCC or agreed upon budget there. So it can be a little bit challenging, and also generally when we talk about the 1.5 degree budget and target, there's a 50% chance of getting there as opposed to a 66% chance for 2 degrees. Here's a recent thing from the Greens Australia that talks about, net zero by 2035 is the way to keep global warming close to 1.5 degrees as possible. So it becomes a little bit, can become confusing. And another interesting organisation, Carbon Brief, that's worth Googling, or we can put it into the notes if I get a chance, or you can check it out. Again, talk about the different windows, and many will say again that 1.5 is completely blown. Others will say that there's a window of anywhere between 2026 and 2042 when emissions, if they're not rapidly reduced, will breach that 1.5 degrees amount. The main game, of course, is actually reducing emissions to zero as soon as possible, and also focusing on action and action planning. And so we're providing information here, and we'll provide carbon budgets if it is of use to you as a council. And if you are setting a target, then I'd suggest take in this information, take in what BZE, what David Spratt, what anyone will say, and look at it. But it really shouldn't be the main game, because the main game is, of course, getting these numbers to zero ASAP. And we need to move on from targets damn quickly to actually strategy, action, implementation, and making sure we're evaluating and putting projects and putting resources and budget in the right area. I think that's my probably take-home messages as well, that we can certainly look at the science and use this as a way to guide, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be the right thing for your community and your council. So do what works for you with an understanding of all the information that we have. Absolutely use the targets to drive action. And so what that means in my mind, in our mind, and again, mentioning that it's even been a bit contested within Ironbark, is that 2030, 2035, what BZE are saying and what we would say and what we generally show through the Science Derived Targets sort of process and carbon budgeting is that you need to move really quickly. And so the scale of the response needs to be commensurate with what we're actually facing and what the problem is, which is getting to zero in 10 to 15 years or as soon as possible. But don't get too caught up on it, would be my advice as well, but instead moving into making sure that time, effort and resourcing is going into the areas that is going to make the most amount of difference. Think about that from a communications point of view as well, and how that's going to work, and learn from what a lot of the other councils have said and the mistakes that have been made in the past by us as a sector. And that also is linked to the accountability side of things. And so I mentioned the Mornington and Yarra Climate Emergency Action Plans. There are some other really good ones out there. And if you're part of the Climate Emergency Australia Network, I'm sure you can get onto the aforementioned David Micklejohn and ask him. But the way that a lot of councils are now talking about targets is great. It's really clear that it says we need to get to zero by 2030 or critical decade or whatever it is. And we will absolutely not be held responsible for all of this, though. This is where other parts of the community need to come into place. And our final bit of advice is always be mercenary. And so do what works for you And so if this isn't going to work, any of this setting targets to actually reduce emissions, then move on to actually just action and doing things as soon as possible. All right, I'm going to now hand over to Sally Moxham from Global Covenant of Mayors to talk about the new report that was released, the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And while I'm doing this here, I'm going to also mention that, Sally, where have you gone?
I'm here.
You're here?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Can you hear me?
I can certainly hear you, but I'm just trying to find you in my list of people because you're not down as a presenter, you're down as someone else. Can I make you presenter? Yes, I can. Okay.
All right.
So you share your screen.
Okay. I'm just going to, yep. I'm going to click on the show my screen button and then click on the PowerPoint. Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yep, it's in the notes view though, so you just need to chuck it into the proper view. Perfect.
All right. So that should be the proper view now. Is that right?
All yours.
Okay, hello everybody. My name's Sally Moxham. I'm the Manager for Strategy and Partnerships for the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy program. I'm employed by ICLEI Oceania in Melbourne, and ICLEI is an international organisation for local governments working for sustainability. It's been around for decades, and Oceania comprises New Zealand, Australia, Papua New Guinea and the South Pacific Island nation states. Just a bit about the Global Covenant of Mayors. It's a program that's focusing on getting local governments to measure community sector greenhouse gas emissions, develop a plan for those emissions to be reduced through a range of actions, and then report against that plan. So one of the things that GCoM, as we call it, program participants need to do is an emissions inventory and also set targets and regularly report against those. So it's been going for a number of years. You can see this picture here, the guidance document was put together by a number of organisations, and they're our partner organisations. You've got CDP, which is the Carbon Disclosure Project, which provides the internet portal for the reporting process. They're in Hong Kong. You've got C40 Cities, WWF, the World Resources Institute. So they're all partners, and they have a relationship to the UNFCCC. So ICLEI, for example, is one of the parties that is represented at the Conference of Parties in terms of providing a local government voice. And the document before you has come out of a funding submission to the Rockefeller Foundation, where they said, actually, there's all this discussion about targets. You know, we've gone from random targets with the zero on the end of them on this journey through to science-based targets. And let's get some funding to actually have a discussion about, you know, what methodologies are out there. So the document focuses on the IPCC goal of keeping climate change to below 1.5 degrees warming, and it focuses on methodologies to aim to look at net zero emissions roughly by 2050, but importantly setting an interim target by 2030, which is a requirement of the suggestion of the IPCC and of the Conference of Parties. So without going into a lot of detail, the document basically says there's three key principles in setting a science-derived target. One, that it's derived by science. Two, that it's equitable, i.e. that countries that pollute more need to take a greater share of the action in reducing those emissions. And thirdly, that emissions, it needs to be a complete portfolio. So you can't just focus on carbon dioxide emissions. You need to pick up your methane, nitrous oxide, and a range of other greenhouse gases. It has to be complete. So it briefly discusses three methodologies. Those methodologies are the Tyndall Centre approach, which is a UK climate think tank, which I won't go into today. It canvasses the two other methodologies. One of those is the One Planet City Challenge, and that methodology looks at all the countries in the world and applies what we call a Human Development Index. So that's an indicator that applies to countries to measure their development progress. And then that is applied in an algorithm to your greenhouse gas inventory, and it gives you a target for 2030. It doesn't give you a carbon budget, and it doesn't give you a trajectory. So it just gives you a percentage reduction target for 2030. So The other option there is looking at the C40 deadline 2020 methodology. And that takes, again, you start off with your emissions inventory, and in working out your 2030 target, what it does, it has two inputs. It works out your city typology, and the two inputs for that are what is your greenhouse gas emissions per capita? And in Australia, that's going to be pretty high, particularly say in Victoria, where we've still got a lot of brown coal. It also then looks at your gross domestic product or your gross city product, so your indicator of economic wealth as a nation. And again, the typology for most Australian cities will be, in terms of GDP, quite high. So what we end up for a 2030 target is a percentage reduction factor of around 70 to 75% for cities, the more wealthy cities. And C40, as you might know, is really focused on the larger cities. The two C40 cities in Australia are Sydney and Melbourne, and Auckland in New Zealand. But you can look at the City of Melbourne's greenhouse mitigation plan, and it has a target within that range. So you can see hypertext links there that will take you to those documents in a lot of detail. Now, for GCoM councils, GCoM and ICLEI don't have a specific target, but point cities in the direction of achieving ambition, which I'll go on and talk about in the next slide. So here we come to the Race to Zero slide. So the Race to Zero is a campaign initiated by the United Nations in the lead up to COP26, which is in Glasgow in November next year. So it's really calling upon local governments. So this is GCoM, ICLEI, calling upon local governments to pledge to reach a net zero target by 2040 or sooner, to then develop an interim target for 2030 that reflects a fair share of the 50% of global reduction in carbon emissions equivalent by 2030, which has been identified in the IPCC report. Then develop a plan, report on that plan, and publish that plan. So for cities interested in being part of the Race to Zero campaign, you can contact ICLEI, contact me, and we'll provide you with more information, but you can hear more of that over the coming months. And this is the boring bit. I just thought I'd point out, here you've got your guide for cities, which came out in November this year, but there's a whole range of documents. Another couple of ones that are relevant would be the global standard for community scale greenhouse gas emission inventories. So what are the accounting protocols you need to know about in terms of setting up your inventory? And I just wanted to point out that if this is all too much, we have a help desk at ICLEI to help people with this process in terms of the GCoM program. And then the third document there is the mitigation standards. So that's for how you measure actions against your plan in terms of like a gold standard. That's all from me. Thanks very much.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Sally. I'm now going to make David presenter and just smash through and do that right now while I give David, I think you can share your screen now, the most briefest of welcomes. So Sally and Imogen have been at these webinars before. If you don't know David, Research Director for Breakthrough National Centre for Climate Restoration, climate policy and science expert, and anyone who has been involved in working in climate, local government or anything for 20 years will have seen David and his colleagues, Phil Sutton, Ian Dunlop, through Green Leap, Climate Code Red, Renew Economy, wherever it might be. David, over to you. You are a bit muted.
How do I share my screen?
Okay, if you open your presentation and then on the top right hand thing you've got the sharing in your GoToWebinar control box, and you should be able to...
Sharing, yes. So I just... do I hit show or change presenter? Show.
Show. Let's see.
Okay. Is that working?
No, not yet. I don't think so anyway. Let's have.
Okay. Look, I'll do it without. Look, thanks for the opportunity. In terms of science-derived targets, obviously the starting point is the IPCC report, particularly the 2018 report. So I just want to talk about the IPCC figures just briefly. The first point, we did a report 2 years ago called What Lies Beneath on what might be called scientific reticence or conservatism, and it particularly focused on the IPCC. And in that report, we had a forward from Professor Hans Joachim Schellenhuber, who's the head of the Potsdam Institute, advisor to the Pope, advisor to the EU, advisor to Angela Merkel. And he said in our comments on IPCC conservatism that, and I quote, when the issue is the survival of civilization, conventional means of scientific analysis may become useless. So that's just a warning to say that the IPCC reports are often conservative. For example, on sea level rise, they said about 0.5 metre to 2100. US government agencies use 2 to 2.5 metres as their worst case example. And why is that relevant? Well, if you look at something like councils in Victoria will be aware of the Fisherman's Bend project near the port in Melbourne, where an old industrial suburb is now being redeveloped to hold 80,000 people. And the US government sea level rise scenarios were not applied, because if you did, and the Victorian government did do not this, you would find that the whole of Fisherman's Bend is likely to be underwater by 2100. So just a warning that IPCC reports are conservative, but in terms of their figures, as Lexi has already indicated, the IPCC has a budget of around 1,170 tonnes of carbon dioxide for a 2/3 chance of 2 degrees, 2/3 chance. If you divide that by the global population, you find that equal per capita shares around the world leads you to 150 tonnes per person of CO2 for the carbon budget. In Australia, we produce more than 20 tonnes a year. Divide 20 into 150, and you find that the IPCC's carbon budget for Australia lasts 7.5 years, from 2018 when the report came out. That means that for Australia, for a 2/3 chance of not exceeding 2 degrees, the budget runs out in 2025. So that's a fairly staggering number for people to come to grips with. And of course, equal per capita emissions are not equitable, because we have a large carbon footprint and developing nations really have a much greater right to that remaining budget than we do. So what's the bottom line from this? The problem is that if you've got a 2/3 chance of not exceeding 2 degrees, you actually have a 10% chance of getting to 3 degrees. So this budget has a 10% chance of getting to 3 degrees, and we would not board a plane. We would not get on a plane if there was a 1 in 10 chance, a 10% chance of crashing, but that's a method of international climate policy making. So these carbon budgets are really very tricky and overestimate the budget that's available, even, as I said, with my figures of Australia's emissions running out in 2025. So what's the take home? Look, the science is really clear. We've just produced a report called Climate Reality Check that's available at climaterealitycheck.net. It's now well understood there is no carbon budget for 1.5. The latest climate models show that we will hit 1.5 in 6 to 8 years from now. 1.5 is really close. Between 2026 and 2028, we're going to hit 1.5. If you want a 10% chance of not exceeding 2 degrees, there's no carbon budget for 2 degrees either. That's what Mike Raupak from CSIRO showed back in 2014. So the question is how fast? I mean, people ask me this all the time. We want a number, and my answer is really simple. How fast should we get to zero? The answer was yesterday. I'm not joking. I mean, it's really serious. I mean, at 1.5 degrees, we'll be past tipping points. When we should have been at zero emissions? Yesterday. How fast? As fast as humanly possible. So, you know, set whatever target you want, but understand that we are shooting way past 1.5. In another decade of emissions, we will have more than 2 degrees locked in, and the system will then become chaotic. So choose whatever number you want. Make it under 2030s if you can, because that's closer to the science, but understand that the real target should have been yesterday. Thanks very much.
That's fantastic, David, and thank you for that. Really clear, and just so you know, I've put in the chat box, everyone can jump on to download the What Lies Beneath report and also Climate Reality Check, and I would concur with what you've just said there. So I think it's interesting. We're coming potentially from different points of view, but Yeah, well said.
We end up in the same place.
We do,
which was yesterday.
as soon as possible.
I'm sure Imogen will agree too.
Yep. And then I guess, and yeah, as you know, our work then is for the councils that have got different drivers, different ways, and different, you know, for those that look at targets and want to know, well, how do we meet it? If it's yesterday, then you're in a bit of trouble. Look, I'm just going to quickly go through some of the questions while I come back and share my screen. One question is there a science-derived sector carbon budget for corporate local government? Again, if you are comfortable with the IPCC science, etc., then yes, there is. And this is actually the SBT, Science-Based Targets Initiative, essentially comes from corporate. And the only reason we're called what we call the Science-Derived Targets is just to differentiate from that and talk about it from a local government point of view. I'm going to make myself presenter and jump in show my screen. Okay, I'm assuming people can see these. Interesting to know if there's general consensus on the budget required to achieve community emissions reductions. I've heard 2 to 5% been mentioned, and there was a similar question that's come through in the GoToWebinar question box from Phil. Are all the targets assuming a linear decrease? No, I mean, I don't think you can. Again, if it's used, and I go back to David's point too, around the point of a target, if it has to be done, then make it as soon as possible. I'd suggest that you can use it if it's for you know, getting to somewhere to make sure that you're factoring in things that are going to be impacting on your emissions profile anyway. So, for example, decarbonisation of the grid, EV take up, it's definitely not going to be linear. What are the presenters' thoughts on the, this is a hard one, so I'm going to go through this quickly, probably going to pass to you, Imogen or David. This is from Tim. What are your thoughts on the BOM 2020 climate report stating we've got 1.44 degrees warming, and how should we use the BOM data to drive action? David, do you want to give that a 30-second shot?
Look, that's warming over Australia, and warming is closer, is higher over land than it is globally. I mean, I think the really disturbing figures which came out today from the United States is that warming globally this year is running at almost 1.3 degrees, 1.29 for the first 11 months of this year. And there's now a 90% chance that that this year will be the highest year on record around the world, even though we're in a La Nina, which is normally cooler. So we are now very close to 1.5. So yes, the urgency is now extreme.
Derek has asked what percentage of Australian councils are members of GCoM. Sally, what are you up to?
I don't have a percentage, but we have about 26 councils that are members in Australia and about 38 councils across the South Pacific and Papua New Guinea. And we're in a recruiting phase at the moment. So if you're interested in GCoM, give me an email and I can send you a whole lot of background information. The International GCoM website has just been updated and it's got lots more information about the kind of pathways and journeys that you need to follow for the GCoM program.
A little bit of informal analysis earlier in the year showed that, I mean, you know, nearly 80–90% of councils are either a part of GCoM, Cities Power Partnership, and or climate emergency, you know, made climate emergency declarations. Yeah, so most are covered one way or another, I guess, by some of those programs. Imogen, I think this is for you. Of the councils addressing community emissions, what percentage are also focusing on operations? Do you know off the top of your head? And Josh is asking because take the approach of practice what we preach. Even if we're only 1% of emissions, it can be seen as enforcement as opposed to leadership.
So I don't have the number in front of me, but I think it was about 10% are doing both at the moment, and about 25% are just doing council only. So I think, yeah, we've still got a big step up to take to get this happening across the board. And yeah, I agree. I think probably the take-home message is spend as little time as possible on your target and as much time as possible on the actions that will actually reduce emissions. And yeah, getting your community involved is a key process to actually enabling this to happen, because council only has control over so much. And I think councils and communities collectively advocating for better solutions at state and federal government level is a key outcome for this to work and for us to achieve it.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm going to ask others for a quick 30-second take-home too, if that's okay. Sally, what's your closing take-home comments? We're going to go a minute over time. I hope that's okay.
I totally agree with Imogen. It's about getting action and it's about getting councillors excited. So, I mean, one of the things that ICLEI does quite well and GCoM does quite well is give councillors a platform to be active in that kind of international advocacy space. But at the end of the day, it's about your community and getting them motivated. Thanks.
David? I'm a councillor. I come to you and I say, David, I want to set a target. Give us advice. What's your take-home message?
Go and talk to the community, involve them. This is about everybody. This is about a council. This is a whole of society, whole of community, whole of council problem. So everybody pitch in. I keep on saying all hands on deck.
Great. I concur. We can, you can set the target, and if it's going to work for you, great. And if undertaking the analysis helps show that it's going to show people that are making the decisions the scale of the problem and the urgency, great. But if not, you just need to move. And I think that's why, yeah, post this, if you're after, and Imogen, we've had many discussions over the year or so about trying to incorporate targets within Snapshot, just really so we can just tick it off and you can move on to the more important stuff, which is action and planning. Same, I guess, to have Snapshot in the first place is to make sure that we can move on from developing profiles to understand where the emissions are from and actually jump onto where the scale of requirements, urgency. I'd say if it is something that you need to do for a program, then make sure it works for you. Otherwise, totally concur with the others. Thank you so much, Imogen, David and Sally, for coming along. In the chat function there, I've got the feedback form. Please give us feedback. We spend a bit of time going through these things, and I hope people realise too at the start when we talk about who you are and the questions that we do try and get to them. So the feedback is much appreciated. Jump on there, and what's more, as soon as you do send that feedback, we will send the information on how you get this document that basically talks a little bit about what we've said today and the various drivers and the various reasons to have targets or otherwise. And I think and I hope that if my colleagues here on the line today were to have a look through that when we talk about the recommendations, we are aligned there. We are absolutely not saying do this and have a target that says 16.3 years. It's about making sure it works for you for action. There it is. It's down the bottom there. I'm going to type that in one or two more times and say thank you very much and farewell for the year. Bring on 2021. We will catch you in the new year. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, all.